This is how you present the buying power checklist as well as the conversation to lead up to the buying power checklist. So, Kelly, are you familiar with what's taking place in the market today?
No, not really.
I'm sure you're seeing things move pretty quickly. You've probably heard things about home prices going up and a lot of activity in the market.
Yeah.
Sure. Do you know anyone that's bought or sold recently?
Not really.
Okay. And how long have you been looking for a home?
For about 2 months.
2 months, okay. And have you noticed anything while you've been searching?
Just that the homes keep selling before we can even look at them sometimes.
Yeah, they're moving pretty fast.
Mhm.
And do you know why that is?
I guess there's just a lot of buyers maybe and not enough homes.
Yeah. There's actually a couple things happening right now. So we have what's considered a lack of inventory and what the experts are calling a seller's market. Are you familiar with the difference between a seller's and a buyer's market?
Not really.
Okay. Well, in a buyer's market, the market is generally, they say buyer's market because it's in favor of buyers. You have a lot of homes to choose from. Generally speaking, sellers have to reduce their price. Usually you can get the home for under asking price. And in the end, you ultimately end up with a pretty good deal on a house in a buyer's market.
Okay.
And a buyer's market comes and goes generally every 5 to 7 years, depending on what's taking place in the economy, depending on inventory levels and so forth.
Okay.
Right now, we're in a seller's market. So the upside to you is that because we're coming out of, as you know, 2008, 9, 10, 11 was a little bit of a depression, recession it was called. They had to lower interest rates in order to get the market moving.
Right.
And so since they lowered interest rates, what took place was home values started going up because more buyers said, "Oh wow, that's a great deal. 4%. That's amazing. Let's do it." So buyers got out there, started buying homes. They had a house to sell. They sold their house, went and bought another, created a lot of activity in the market,
Okay.
and that's what actually drove the prices up
Okay.
to the prices that they're at today. Now the good news is that you're still getting in at a good time in terms of an interest rate. So, because buyers say all the time, well, if I'm buying at the top of the market, shouldn't I just wait?
Mhm.
Well, it doesn't necessarily make sense to wait unless you're paying cash.
Mhm.
And even still, we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know what the market's going to do, even if you're paying cash.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because even if prices do drop, let's say 10% over the next year or 2 years, okay? 10% on a $200,000 house is $20,000 that you would save, right?
Oh, wow.
Which is a good thing if you were to wait. Now, the reason why we don't generally recommend that somebody wait until prices come down and wait until it's a buyer's market is because when a market is hot, generally speaking, the feds will raise the interest rates, which means that it will cost you more to borrow money. Right now, the rates are about 4.5%. 10 years ago, they were 6%. So it's not like they go up a lot. I mean, if they go up, they might go up a point or a point and a half.
Okay.
But if you think about it, going from 4.5 to say 5.5 increase in an interest rate is about a 20% interest increase in your cost,
Mhm.
right? So if you go from 4.5 to 5.5, even though it's 1%,
Mhm.
that's going from 4.5 to 5.5 is actually a 20% increase.
Okay.
So what that means is even though the home may be worth 10% less because it's buyer's market, if you're paying 20% more, in the end you still actually end up paying more for the house
Right.
over the life of the 30-year loan.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's why when we get the question, well, should I wait because inventory level is low? Well, you can wait and probably get a house for a better price, but you're going to pay more for it in the long run because of the interest rate increase that typically takes place.
Right.
And again, I don't have a crystal ball, so I couldn't tell you exactly what the interest rates will go up to or if they'll even go up. But this is just based on history, what we've seen over the last several years.
Okay.
And if you haven't been paying attention to the market, I kind of just drew out before you got here, just kind of a quick graph. And of course, it's rough sketch. I just drew it a few minutes ago. And it kind of shows you, starting back from 2000, what took place in the market. In the year 2000, prices went steadily up for a good 5 years or so. In fact, if I went back to 95, you'd see the same thing. From 1995 to 2005, they had a nice steady increase of about 3 to 5% per year,
Okay.
which is normal. And then we got to about the peak, which is the end of 2005, the beginning of 2006, and all of a sudden, economy changed, jobs changed. We went through presidency changes over those years. A lot of things took place, and that caused us to go into that Great Recession.
Okay.
So everything we gained from 1995 to 2005, we lost in 5 years. So what took us 10 years to gain, we lost in 5.
Okay.
And 2010 was our true bottom of the market, meaning since 2010, our prices have been steadily going up.
Okay.
In fact, from 2010 to 2015, we gained almost all of it back because the inventory levels were so low and the interest rates were so low. So here we are today, still on a pretty steady climb and in a strong market, and that's why with the inventory levels as low as they are, we're getting our most of the buyers out there in the market are getting into multiple offer situations.
Okay.
And that goes back to the inventory levels. To give you an idea, at the bottom here, we had over 100,000 homes for sale in Southeast Michigan.
Okay.
Today, we have 15,000.
Oh wow.
So, and the buyer activity is still pretty strong. So if you think about it, if there's less homes to choose from, guess what? If you're looking at a great house, somebody else is probably looking at it too, right?
Yeah.
So what we've put together is what's called a buying power checklist. And the buying power checklist is armed with information to give you a leg up, to give you advantage on the competition. Your competition, good, bad, right, or wrong, is other buyers. And so there are certain things that our buyers are having to do to get their offer to stand out. Now, when you hear some of these things, you'll think, well, gosh, it sounds like this is really in favor of the sellers. Well, that's unfortunately because it is, because it's a seller's market. And again, I go back to, well, why am I buying right now? Well, you're buying right now because it's still cheap to buy, right? The money is only 4.5%, where it could be 5.5% or 6%, like we saw 10 years ago, which means you actually end up paying more in the long run.
Right.
So I'm going to go through this list with you and just explain what each one of these is. I'm not going to bore you to death with all the details. I'm going to touch on each one just so that way when we get to a point to where you say, Jeff, I love this house on Banana Street, I have to have it, you'll know exactly what you can do to arm yourself to put you in first position or at least in the top 3 contenders for that property.
Okay.
A lot of the properties right now have 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 offers. And so most of these agents, what they're doing is they're just telling their buyer to write up their best offer and we'll see what happens. This is arming you with some things that the competition doesn't know or isn't doing in their offers. Fair enough?
Okay.
I'll walk you through it now. Okay, and these are in no particular order, by the way.
Okay.
So, you may do a few of these on your offer, you may do one of them, you may do all of them, depending on how bad you want the house.
Okay.
And just so you know, I'll always have a conversation with the listing agent to get as much information as I can about the seller and what's important to them.
Okay.
So that way we can tailor the buying power checklist to what the seller is looking for.
Great.
Fair enough? So one of the things that you can do in this market right now is offer free occupancy.
Okay.
Free occupancy is basically when you allow the seller to stay in the home after closing. It's basically like they're renting the house back from you, but at no charge. Now, the reason why this is attractive to a seller is because generally speaking, a seller, when they sell their home, they now need to go shop for another house. So because that process takes time, as we talked about earlier, I went through that timing analysis with you, because it takes time, they need to stay in their home a little bit longer after closing.
Okay.
So sometimes it's a couple weeks, sometimes it's a couple months. Generally speaking, it's around 30 days.
Okay.
And so the reason why free occupancy is attractive, number one, because you're giving them time so they're not rushed, that's good. And then you're not charging them for it, which makes it more attractive.
Okay.
The cost to you, assuming you're shopping around $250,000 like you shared with me earlier, the cost to you really is nothing out of pocket because your mortgage payment doesn't start for a month after you close. But the cost to you, if you go back and calculate it, it truly did cost you a month's rent or a month's payment, which would be about $1,500 at that price range, plus or minus a little bit.
Okay.
So yes, it's still a $1,500 expense, but it's a big offering to the seller and could be something that causes them to take your offer over another one.
Okay.
Make sense?
Perfect.
Great. The next one on here is in depending on the particular city that you're shopping in, is you are willing to assume the city inspection. Some cities require that the seller provide a certificate of occupancy in order to sell the house. In this particular case, if you find a home in a city that requires it, you may say to the seller, you know what, I'll take that on. I love the house. I see that it needs a little bit of work. Yeah, the electrical needs to be updated. I'll take that on.
Okay.
That is an option that you have, and that would cause your offer to stand out over another buyer's potential offer.
Okay.
It's less headaches for the seller.
Right.
Next, you could offer extended occupancy. So we talked about offering the free occupancy. Extended occupancy would be a number that's above and beyond the norm. So I said the norm is about 30 days. Sometimes the seller only needs 2 weeks. Sometimes the seller's building a house and needs 2 or 3 months. There's not many buyers out there that would be willing to wait to get into a home. Now this goes back to the timing analysis. If you had the time, give it to them because it's going to make your offer stand out.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Yep.
If you're an FHA borrower, then you could, when you put together the FHA, there's a document we use called an FHA addendum. And on the FHA addendum, it states that the seller will pay up to blank amount of any repairs.
Okay.
See, an FHA appraisal, generally, they go through a house and they may have 1 or 2 things that they want done in order to lend money on that house. Well, it's negotiable who does those repairs. Sometimes buyers will ask a seller, we want you to take on those repairs. Okay? If you do that, chances of your offer getting accepted in this market are very slim.
Okay.
So you would actually put in the addendum that says the seller is responsible for up to $0 of those repairs,
Okay.
causing your offer to stand out and making it more attractive if you're FHA.
Okay.
Makes sense? Now the downside is you're responsible for those repairs, and sometimes you have to get them done before closing, or we can set aside money in escrow to get them done. But again, if that's what it takes to get the house, you may have to do that.
Okay.
Make sense? Another real common one right now is paying over appraised value. Paying over appraised value, of course, is never fun because appraiser comes in and says, I know you agreed to buy for $200,000. The home is only worth $180,000. What do you want to do, basically? And so you have a couple options there. Of course, you have the option, if we did not agree to pay over the appraised value, it's already pre-written into the purchase agreements to declare the offer null and void. Okay, now most buyers don't want to do that because there's a line of other people that want to buy that house if your deal falls through.
Right.
So what we try to do is we try to get the seller to reduce a little bit, kind of meet in the middle. So if it appraises at 180 and we sell for 200, okay, let's see if the seller can come down to 190. The downside is that you're paying $10,000 more than the home appraised for,
Okay.
but you're still getting it for $10,000 less than what you actually agreed to buy it at.
Okay.
Now that's something that we can put into the purchase agreement up front to make the seller feel more comfortable. So they know when they're staring at that purchase agreement, wow, this buyer's willing to give me $10,000 over appraised value. That's strong. Now we always put a clause in there that says it cannot exceed the sales price.
Okay.
So if you agree to buy it at 200 and it appraises at 195, you don't have to buy it at 205.
Okay.
It's capped
Okay.
at 200.
Okay.
Make sense? Unfortunately, that extra 10K is out of pocket though, and that is something that buyers are doing right now to make their offer stand out.
Okay.
And if you have the money to do it, I would recommend it.
Okay.
Now, you were planning on putting about 10% down on your loan, is that right?
Yep.
So one thing I will mention to you, since you already are aware of PMI, right? Academy explained to you about PMI.
Yep.
So PMI in your price range is probably $150 or $200 a month. You're already paying the PMI. So one thing that we're seeing buyers do in your particular situation is go from putting 10% down on their loan to 5% down, and 5% of 200,000 is what, 10 grand. There you go. So you could put 5% down on your loan and agree to pay up to $10,000 over appraised value, and you're really not any more out of pocket than you had already planned on.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And the PMI doesn't go up that much between 10% down and 5% down.
Okay.
I mean, we're talking maybe 10 or 15 bucks a month.
Okay.
So
Makes sense.
that could be one thing you could do to cause your offer to stand out, and it's very common right now. Another option you have is to waive the appraisal altogether. Now, this would be if you absolutely had to have a house and money was no object. Because when you waive the appraisal altogether, you're basically telling the seller, look, I'll pay 200 even if it appraises 150. I don't care.
Okay.
And the challenge with that is there's no cap to it. So you could be stuck paying $5,000 or $50,000. Again, depends on how bad you want a house. I'll bring it up to you at the time of offer. If you want to do that, you can. I recommend at least putting a cap.
Okay.
I'll tell you at the $200,000 price level, generally the cap is around 5%,
Okay.
which would be 10 grand.
Okay.
Sometimes we see 15, but usually it's 5 to 10 grand at your price point. Make sense? One of the nice things that you can do to cause your offer to stand out is make sure it's not contingent on sale or close of your home. Okay, sale is deadly. Contingent on sale means that your home still has to sell. You haven't even found a buyer for the home that you're selling. At least contingent on closing is a little bit better because you're saying, look, here we have a purchase agreement in hand. Just give us an opportunity to close this, and then once our listing gets closed, we'll remove that contingency and move forward.
Okay.
All things being equal, though, if you're looking at 3 offers and one has one other chance of not making it to the closing table, which one are you probably not going to select?
Right.
The one that has less of a chance of
Yep.
getting to a closing table. So we recommend, whenever possible, and of course you'd have to check with your lender to make sure you qualify, to not put a contingency on sale or close.
Okay.
Make sense? Great. The other thing that's taking place right now is it's kind of commonplace in the market, or has been for years, that the earnest money deposit, basically your good faith deposit, is 1%. It's been like that for years and years. Well, when I first started in the business 14 years ago, it was actually 3% was common. Somehow it went down to 1, I'm not sure. So when you go put an offer on a house at $200,000, prior to this hot seller's market, a couple $1,000s good faith deposit was normal. Now we're seeing good faith deposits of $5,000, $10,000. So I would recommend at least a 3% earnest money deposit. And that is the check that you write to show that your offer is good for more than the paper it's written on.
Okay.
If for whatever reason you have a bad inspection or your financing falls through, you get that check back.
Okay.
The only way you'd actually lose that money is if you defaulted, meaning you just tell the seller you change your mind and you're going in another direction.
Okay.
You would lose it at that point.
Okay.
But you still have the contingency on inspection, and if your financing falls through, you have a contingency on financing, you would get that back.
Okay.
So if you increase the earnest money deposit a little bit, could you see how the seller would feel a little bit better about your offer and the strength of it?
Yeah.
And that's what this is all about, the strength
Okay.
of the offer. Full lender approval, not just a pre-approval. I know you've already spoken to Academy, and that's good, and I appreciate that you've got a pre-approval. A full lender approval means picking up the phone to Academy and saying, hey, we really want this house. Can you get my stuff, as much stuff as you can, to get me a document that says conditionally approved?
Okay.
And that means, there's a few stipulations left over, but it's a stronger approval. It's a conditional approval versus a pre-approval.
Okay.
Pre-approval is just asking you what you make, maybe checking your credit score, asking you a few questions about how much money you have in the bank. Anyone can produce a pre-approval. But if you're a seller and I'm a seller's agent and you hand me a document that says conditionally approved and then I can see the conditions on there, meaning what you need to provide in order to get the full approval, I'm going to feel more comfortable with that than an actual pre-approval. And I can help you with that, and of course that's something you want to talk to Academy about. Make sense? Great. Another thing that buyers are doing right now, again, I don't necessarily recommend it. It's one of those things if you absolutely have to have the house, and that is a non-refundable earnest money deposit, which basically says, I saw your house, I don't care what the inspection says, I don't care what the appraisal says. If I don't close, you get to keep that $5,000 or that $6,000, that 3% we just talked about. That's what's called a non-refundable earnest money deposit. Generally, I don't recommend it. It's only one of those things if you absolutely had to have the house and money was no object. But it's my job as your agent to let you know that that's an option. So that way, if there's a case where you do lose out on a home and I call you, and hopefully this isn't the case, and I have to say, hey, Kelly, you're not going to believe it. We had a great offer, but we lost out to another buyer because they were willing to waive their earnest money deposit and make it non-refundable. I don't want you to say, well, Jeff, why didn't you tell me about that option? I don't recommend it, but it is an option. Okay. Next, you have here more money down on loan than typical for the price range. Now, this is hard to control if you're shopping in $200,000 and you're only planning on putting 5 or 10% down. That would apply to a buyer if they were already putting 20 and they had a lot of money in the bank above and beyond the 20. I might encourage them to put 30% down or 40% down if they have it, to just make their offer stand out. Keep in mind the seller is looking for 2 things: money and odds of closing. So more money down means a higher odds of closing. Make sense? Great. Next I have on here appraisal first at the same time as inspection. Now this is not as risky. In fact, I like this one because the only thing the only risk on your part is that if you do the appraisal and the inspection and you have them set up at the same time in, say, the first week, it's attractive to the seller because they can get everything figured out within a week to 10 days. The downside to you as a buyer is you're going to have to outlay cash for a home inspection and an appraisal at the same time. And the reason why I'm explaining it to you that way is because usually one is done before the other. So you spend $400 on a home inspection, everything checks out fine. Now you spend another $400 on the appraisal and you move forward.
Okay.
In this particular case, to get your offer to stand out and to be more attractive, you do them both in the same week. The downside is you're out $800 right away versus $400 first and then maybe $400 later if you're happy with the
Okay.
inspection.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that is an option, and that's something that's attractive to the seller because they find out right away within the first week or 10 days whether
Right.
this deal's moving forward or not.
Right.
Many times a buyer or a lender will drag on the appraisal or not get it done until halfway through the closing period, and that of course is not something that a seller wants to deal with. Again, just something you can do to cause your offer to stand out. No seller concessions. This means that we cannot ask the seller for help with closing costs. You've probably heard of that
Right.
before.
Yeah.
2008, 9, 10, 11, buyers were getting concessions all the time, help with closing costs. If you don't, my rule of thumb on this is if you don't need it, don't ask for it.
Okay.
It will quickly put your offer to the bottom of the pile.
Okay.
Okay. Next, proof of earnest money deposit and down payment funds. This is a simple one, and actually there's no risk to you, and it's just a little extra effort that can go a long way. What that is basically saying, okay, here's our $6,000 earnest money deposit, and here's the 20 grand we're putting down on the house. And oh, by the way, here's a copy of a bank statement with $40,000 in it, or $30,000 in it, or $25,000 in it. Whatever it is, it's an amount that supports the down payment and the earnest money deposit check that we're telling them we're going to give. It doesn't, I mean, other than making a call to your bank and saying, hey, can you get me this, or pulling up a recent statement, doesn't take a lot of effort on your part, and it's really no risk. And it's just one more tool that we can put in front of a buyer or a seller's agent and say, hey, here's proof of our EMD. Here's proof of our down payment. It's helpful.
Yeah.
Next is a personal letter from the buyer, and I have written down here, relate to them. So when we tour a home, you're going to see certain things in a home that you absolutely love. You're going to see things that you absolutely hate. What we recommend our buyers do when they're submitting an offer, and that is to write a letter directly to the seller. And you can put whatever you want in that letter, but we want it to tug at their heartstrings. We want them to feel a little bit of an emotional bond, right? It's not just a piece of paper that the offer is from. Here is the person or the family or whoever the offer is from, and here's why they want your house so bad.
Okay.
And I try to tell our buyers, find something in the house that you relate to. Did you go to the same school? Did you see that they got something on the wall that you have? Just something that you can relate to make sure you mention in that letter.
Okay.
And when it comes time to do the offer consultation that we talked about, we have some sample letters for you. So we'll make it easy on you. We can't write it by law. You have to write it. But I'll give you some good guidelines to go by and some samples for other buyers. Fair enough? Great. Shorter timelines. So shorter timelines is good because, again, the seller wants, I said two things. They really want three things. The most money, highest odds of closing, and the fastest close. They want their money fast. So shorter timelines means instead of taking 10 days to do a home inspection, we get it done in 5. Or we do the home inspection and the appraisal in 7 days, right? We shorten everything. Closing date, instead of putting 45 days out there, which is kind of the normal right now, we call Academy and say, hey, what are the chances we can close this in 25 days?
Okay.
You're clean as a whistle, we can close in 25 days. We're going to put a closing date of 25 days.
Okay.
Seller gets their money faster. They're excited about that. Greater chance your offer gets accepted. Make sense? This one here is a little tougher. Buyer knows the seller. By law, I cannot advise you to make contact with the seller in any way. I will tell you of some experiences that have worked out in our buyer's favor, and that is somehow the buyer found out who the seller was, found him on Facebook, they had mutual friends, reached out to the mutual friends, and it worked in our favor. There's been times where it's also backfired. So I can't encourage you to do that. I'm not going to recommend you do that. I've had buyers literally go up to the seller's door, knock on their door, and introduce themselves.
Okay.
It's helped. And it's hurt. Now, it has done more good than harm, but again, I can't recommend you do that. If by chance, as you're walking through a house or when you're getting ready to make an offer with us on a house, you realize you know the buyer somehow, do what you want with it, but I can't recommend you do that.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Okay.
Okay, good. Next, offer over asking price. That's a pretty basic one. If the home is priced to sell, it's new on the market, very common that buyers are going in over asking.
Okay.
But as we talked about before, that really doesn't matter. It's really more about what you're willing to pay over appraised value,
Right.
because offering over asking makes no difference to a seller if the appraisal comes in low.
Yeah.
If a home's been on the market for 3, 4, or 5 weeks, we don't necessarily have to offer over asking because the listing has probably become stale unless they just did a price reduction.
Okay.
Nonetheless, anytime you find a house that you like, that you're getting ready, that you want to make an offer on, I'm going to do as much research as I can to find out if it's truly in a multiple offer situation, priced well. You know, I'm going to talk to the seller or the agent to find out what's most important to the seller, and at that point in time, we'll decide whether it makes sense to make an offer over asking, and I'll advise you of that at that time.
Okay.
That's a very common one. Okay, cash buyer. Obviously, if you're buying the house cash, that's something you can do to make your offer stand out. Cash is king. Generally, cash comes with no appraisal as well. We would literally strike out the appraisal clause if you're a cash buyer.
Okay.
Conventional financing, we already talked about that. You know, conventional financing is stronger than FHA, and I understand you're doing conventional, so that's good. FHA is considered weaker because it has a reputation of more loopholes that the seller has to jump through. And really, in actuality, there isn't that much more, especially if you put the sellers responsible for zero cost. It's just the stigma, the reputation that it has. Sellers and sellers agents, unfortunately, will choose a conventional offer over an FHA any day of the week, unless, you know, $0 towards repairs, willing to pay over appraised value, shorter time frames, higher EMD, right? So FHA is not out of the question. Buyers can still get their offers approved FHA as long as everything else checks out good, or if all the other offers happen to be FHA.
Right.
Okay, in your price range that you're shopping, conventional is very common.
Okay.
Finally, last but not least, you have the option to waive the inspection. Again, not something that we recommend. We see it from time to time. Comes down to how bad do you want the house and what kind of shape do you think the house is in. Now, of course, if we're walking through a 2014 built house, everything looks good. I mean, besides for going in the attic or checking behind, you know, checking the basement walls, you can assume pretty much everything's in good shape. Okay. But we don't necessarily want you to waive your inspection, and we recommend that you don't. It kind of goes back to that other one I explained. I don't want to call you and say, hey, Kelly, our offer was fantastic. Only problem is we lost to a buyer that said we don't need an inspection.
Right.
And then you say, well, Jeff, why didn't you tell me that was an option? It's an option. We just don't recommend it.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Yep.
Questions on this?
No, I think you explained it very well.
Good. So in a nutshell, I know it can be a little bit intimidating because it's a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of things in here that you're saying, well, geez, none of these are really working in my favor. Who is this Jeff working for, me or the seller? I'm working for you, and I'm arming you with the information you need to acquire a home.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there are tons of buyers out there who will be our competition that don't have these conversations with their real estate agents, and they're looking at 10, 15, 20 houses, losing out on 3, 4, 5, 6 offers because they're not doing any of this stuff.
Okay.
And so feel confident walking out of here knowing that you are armed with what it takes to acquire a home in today's market, and we'll find you one within a reasonable time frame.
Okay, sounds good.
Fair enough?
Fair enough.
All right, I'm looking forward to going to work for you.
Thank you.
Yep, you got it.